The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we look at whether foreign broadcasters such as Fox News should be banned in Canada. Then we get an update on how fast measles are spreading across the province. And finally, we'll debate the age-old question of which animals are better, dogs or cats. No, just kidding. Happy April Fool's Day. That's all ahead on the agenda. Should Canada consider clamping down on foreign broadcasters? Given Fox News' inflammatory commentary questioning Canadian sovereignty, some are suggesting the CRTC consider banning it as it did RT, the Russian state-controlled channel. Does banning these channels constitute an attack on free speech? Let's discuss with, in Calgary, Alberta, Peter Menzies, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and former Vice Chair of Communications for the CRTC. In the nation's capital, Christopher Dornan, former professor at the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University. And with us here in studio, Joanna Barron, Executive Director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and Jeffrey Dvorkin, Senior Fellow at U of T's Massey College and a former journalist with NPR News and CBC Radio. And it's great to have you two here in our studio. And to our friends in Points Beyond, thanks for joining us on TVO tonight. We're going to show a little clip to get our segment started here because I don't know how many of you watch Jesse Waters on Fox. You're shaking your head already. But he's, what shall we call him, colorful. And this is the kind of stuff he says. Sheldon, roll it if you would.
Yesterday, our neighbors to the north decided they wanted to do things the hard way. They slapped a 25% tariff on electricity coming into the country, which would jack up utility prices in New York, Michigan, Minnesota. Trump hit back this morning, announcing he was doubling the tariffs on Canadian steel from 25% to 50%. The Canadians didn't like that, and they fired the first official shot of the American-Canadian War.
Let me be clear. I will not hesitate to increase this charge. If necessary, if the United States escalates, I will not hesitate to shut the electricity off completely.
That's an act of war.
I almost don't know where to begin because Jesse's a very amusing guy, but he's, you know, an ignoramus and says stuff that I think is kind of, well, that Canadians probably think is completely ridiculous. But the question, Joanna, is should it be disallowed on our airwaves? What do you say?
So no, this is clickbait dressed up as commentary. Jesse Waters, even though he may echo some of the rhetoric from the Trump administration, he's an independent broadcaster. He does not speak for the U.S. government. And we should allow this and we should respond to it in due course.
Peter, what do you say?
I get that people would find it offensive, but I mean, I've listened to rhetoric coming out of Quebec for 50 years, doubting Canadian sovereignty and talking about outrages and that sort of stuff. And we've survived. We move on through these things. And I think just one kind of, infotainment presentation doesn't justify removing these guys from their cable license.
Christopher, presumably there's some line somewhere which, if you're on one side of it, you may not like what they say, but it's acceptable. And if you're on the other side of it, it is unacceptable and it is, I guess, illegal. Where does this fall on that line?
Well, at the moment, it's certainly not illegal. Fox News itself, as an organization, is on record in a court of law saying that you shouldn't take what its hosts say seriously or literally. Tucker Carlson was sued by a former Playboy model who had been paid $150,000 by Donald Trump to keep quiet about an affair that they had. Tucker Carlson described this as classic extortion. The Playboy model sued for slander. And Fox News' defense was that no reasonable viewer would take what Tucker Carlson says at that literal value, that he's an entertainer, he's a kind of circus freak. And the judge agreed with that defense.
Okay, Jeffrey, Where on the sort of scale of stupidity would you put that kind of statement, and is it egregious enough to warrant being chucked off our airwaves?
It's weird, it's stupid, but I don't think that taking him off the airwaves is the appropriate response. Because if the CRTC were to do that, then they would make themselves open to any other pressure points. For example, people who want to defund public broadcasting. And in that case, if the one precedent has already been set, and it has to a certain extent with Russian television, with RT, what's to stop an organized campaign from saying, let's get rid of the CBC or, God forbid, TVO?
Thank you. Take your point. However, we do have the precedent, Joanna, of RT, Russian television, which was kicked off cable systems here in Canada because CRTC in its wisdom decided it was just blatantly outright propaganda. You could say the same for Fox, couldn't you?
So I'd say there's three important distinctions. First, RT is state-controlled. Fox News, although again, it certainly seems to have a cozy relationship with Republican Party rhetoric, it is an independent broadcaster. Second of all, it was broadcasting repeated systemic threats during an active military campaign. So it was directly acting as Putin's mouthpiece. Third of all, one of the rationales and one of the things that links in with the CRTC statute is that RT was also broadcasting propaganda against Ukrainian Canadians, which are an identifiable group protected under existing human rights, hate speech provisions. So that is a very outside case, although maybe some of the other guests disagree with banning RT, but I think there's a lot of distance between the rationale of banning RT and what we're seeing now on Fox News.
Peter, can we make that case that RT is so different that it's not a precedent for this case?
Well, yes, because RT was basically, to all intents and purposes, the CRTC was directed to do that by the government. And by the time it made the decision, it was kind of moot anyway, because all the cable companies had already removed RT. It's worth noting that since 2019, the CRTC has been sitting on a complaint from Peter Dolan of Safeguard Defenders against CGTN and CCTV, both Chinese state television, which are available and still licensed in Canada. And his complaint was based on the fact they were showing forced confessions. The CRTC hasn't moved on that for close to 5.5 years now. So left to its own devices, it is obviously kind of okay with certain, when this is a broader discussion, with certain propaganda-based state television networks.
In which case, Jeffrey, let me ask this. Are foreign channels held to the same standards as Canadian-based channels when it comes to the acceptability of having them on cable or whatever?
I'm nervous when the government tells us what we can and cannot consume in terms of media. And I think that the public is sufficiently sophisticated both in the U.S. and Canada, to understand that there's a difference, maybe a difference without a distinction, about commentary and actual information reporting. Fox News has actually a pretty substantial news operation as opposed to its evening entertainment bloviating. And I think that to ban Fox News entirely would be a disservice to those Canadians who want to get a particular perspective from the United States. And I think that if Canada goes down that line, we end up in a very shaky position when it comes to free speech. As I would tell my students when I was teaching at U of T Scarborough, you don't have the right, students, not to be offended by something. And at some point, when, God willing, you all get jobs with media organizations, your assignment editor will say, we want you to go and interview someone with whom you really disagree. And if you were to say, oh, I'm too sensitive to talk to this person,
you're in the wrong business.
You're in the wrong business,
yeah.
Exactly.
Christopher, let me read some of a little snippet here from the CRTC's decision on why they decided to get rid of RT as an option for Canadian viewers, and then have you come back with some comments on that. RT's programming is not consistent, says the CRTC, with the standards against which Canadian services are measured, nor the policy objectives set out in the Broadcasting Act. The CRTC is also concerned with programming from a foreign country that seeks to undermine the sovereignty of another country, demean Canadians of a particular ethnic background, and undermine democratic institutions within Canada. Okay, Christopher, couldn't you say that Fox, and Jesse in particular, was doing all of those things?
Yes, you could. And I think that if the political temperature between Canada and the United States actually changes, then there may be a legitimate case and an urgent need to remove Fox News from Canadian cable and satellite channels. If it moves away beyond just sort of hyperbolic exaggeration for entertainment value, if it becomes evident that the United States is genuinely and seriously has set itself on the economic ruin and the political subjugation and the territorial absorption of Canada. I mean, basically, if we're on a war footing, then it may become necessary, certainly to threaten to remove Fox News from the Canadian media diet. Because just as you don't buy weaponry from an enemy, we're revisiting the purchase of the F-35 fighter jets, you don't willingly give a propaganda platform to the same enemy. So the RT case, I mean, you said, well, we removed it because it was a propaganda outlet. That's actually not why we renewed it. We renewed it under the hate speech provisions, that it was exposing Ukrainians and Ukrainian Canadians to contempt and putting them in harm. If the political temperature between Canada and the United States becomes so charged that we're on the verge of conflict, then the circumstances have completely changed, and we will have to revisit whether we would allow somebody like Jesse Waters to mouth off to our detriment.
All right, Joanna, tell me, Sheldon, quote board number 2, please. Tell me if, in your view, this rises to the level of hate speech. This is also from Jesse Waters, who said, the fact that they don't want us to take them over makes me want to invade. I want to quench my imperialist thirst. Does that sound like hate speech to you?
It sounds like satire soaked in insolence. I hate it. Do I think that the state should ban it? Absolutely not. And I also want to make a point. Think about this geopolitically. Do we really want to hand Trump and Fox News a perfect, wrapped with a bow case example of liberal elites banning conservative viewpoints? It wouldn't strengthen our position. It would make us a laughingstock. And we can handle this. We can laugh back. This is a joke.
Peter, any risks in airing this kind of drivel?
I don't think so. I mean, it's drivel, right? I mean, there's drivel all over the place if you look hard enough for it. I think there's great risk in talking about banning things like this, because, as Joanna just said, I mean, it would just, Fox News would just more than double down. They would triple down and say Fox News banned by Canada, like, in the way they'd go and just beat up on us more and more. It would be useless. It would also cut us off from a good platform that our politicians have been using to try to communicate to Trump's base, which is very much a Fox News crowd. Doug Ford, Daniel Smith, others have been interviewed by them and been able to make the case against tariffs to that audience. So I think it would be, I don't think you find freedom through authoritarian acts. Let me put it that way.
Freedom through authoritarian, okay, that's an interesting way to put it. Jeffrey, how about to you on that one? How much bloviating, it sounds like, that was your word, I love that word, incidentally. How much bloviating should a guy, be entitled to do before he's nuzzling up against hate speech?
Well, hate speech has a certain definition, both journalistically and legally, and one has to be very careful in this country to determine the differences between or among the various points of view that get expressed. CRTC needs to understand, as I hope they do, that there's this new thing called the internet, and that people who want to consume certain kinds of information can do it without the approval of the CRTC. So I think it's kind of an academic, if you'll pardon the expression, argument. And I was reminded of the good old days when in the Cold War, when the Russians would scramble the signals of the Voice of America or Radio Free Europe. I don't think we want to get into the scrambling business anymore. We don't have someone like Lord Ha-Ha, who broadcast German propaganda on Britain during the Second World War, or Tokyo Rose, who told American troops fighting in the Pacific that their wives were having affairs while they were away to try to demoralize them. We're not at that point. And so I don't think we need to use our media carefully and substantially in order to serve the public as citizens first and consumers of information second. That to me seems to be the essential element here.
Do you see any risks at all in letting him continue to have access to Canadians via Fox News?
Well, we've seen the opposite reaction, right? We've seen unprecedented amounts, surges of patriotism. The I Am Canadian ad is back. So I personally have faith in the immune system of Canadian civil society to see this and reject it.
Peter, what about you? Any risks at all here?
I don't see it. I mean, I think the risks are in the reaction and overreacting to these sorts of things. I mean, I think we should remember that Fox News isn't like on your basic cable or anything. If you're going to be watching it, you have to subscribe specifically to it, just as you did have to do with RT, and you have to do with CCTV, the Chinese state thing. So it is not forced upon you, or it doesn't come to you unwillingly. You have to make the choice to accept it yourself, and agreed with everything Jeffrey just said about the internet.
Speaking of
the
which,
CRTC actually said in the RT decision that it wasn't an offense against free speech because, after all, people can still watch it on the internet.
Right. Jeffrey.
I spent a few years in Washington, so I've drunk enough Potomac water to be influenced by the incredible power of the First Amendment to the American Constitution. And Justice Louis Brandeis said that sunlight is the great disinfectant. And yeah, we are going to have to put up with some oddities, Jesse Waters being one of them. But I think that in the end, the idea that people have the right and the obligation to understand what the heck's going on. And I think that sunlight really is the best disinfectant. It may be painful for a while to hear Jesse Waters do his thing, but I think in the end, reasonableness and good sense will prevail, both in the United States and especially in Canada.
I mean, Christopher, one of the reasons we're doing this program is that there are plenty of comments out there on the internet, letters to the editor in newspapers, emails that we get from people who see these kinds of comments that Jesse Waters is making and ask themselves, how can this be allowed on Canadian television? Shouldn't we ban that kind of thing? So let me ask you the opposite side of the coin, which is, what would be the risk in banning Fox News from Canadians?
Well, as Joanna pointed out, if we were to do so now, you hand the American administration, you hand Fox News, you hand the right wing, you hand even Canadians themselves an example of government overreach or Canadian overreach, an attempt to silence viewpoints that you disagree with. I think Jeffrey's right. At the moment, reasonableness will prevail, but we're also dealing with a government south of the border that is not reasonable. And if things change, if the temperature escalates between the two countries, then the circumstances change, and then we may not go immediately to ban Fox News, but it may become a bargaining chip. Where we threaten to do so, or we open public inquiries. One of the things that the cable and satellite providers could do is, at the moment, when you get Fox News, it's bundled in with other news channels. They could choose to say, well, that's actually not a news channel, despite, as Jeffrey points out, that it does actually have a reasonably responsible news division. What it really has in the showroom window is Hannity and Ingraham and Waters and the bloviators. And the cable providers could say, well, that's not a conscientious news operation. That's an entertainment channel. So bundle it with the entertainment channels.
Joanna, let me give you another example, and you tell me how, if you believe it is, this is different. When all this mishigas started happening, Doug Ford went behind a lectern and he said, I want every American-made bottle of booze off the shelves of the LCBO. He banned an American product from Canadians, from Ontarians. How is this different?
So first of all, the LCBO is one of the biggest purchasers of alcohol in the world, so that actually kind of hits the Americans where it hurts. I don't think banning Fox News would do that. Second of all, I'm Canadian, so I'm more concerned about the effect of all of this on our culture and our country. And allowing the CRTC, if it were to take this step of going beyond the RT precedent, let's call it, what's to prevent a future government from directing the CRTC to ban Al Jazeera English or a progressive channel that's critical of climate policy? It would set this very dangerous broad precedent for state censorship.
Peter, can I get you on that? Apparently it was okay to ban American booze on our shelves. What's wrong with banning American channels on our TV sets?
Well, I mean, there's a bit of nuance here, right? Okay, so having a cable license, being licensed as a foreign cable channel, is much different than booze. One is the flow of information, one is the flow of a product. I mean, you can say that information is a product, but I don't know that drinking Jack Daniels is a risk to your sovereignty one way or the other, right? When you get into that. So in the CRTC, in the broader picture, as Joanna said, it really, and I mean, I worked there for 10 years, you don't want to get into picking winners and losers, because somebody's winner is somebody else's loser. And you just go down that road and you start deciding what is acceptable speech in terms of that. And we have criminal laws that monitor that. And I think those are more than sufficient. The CRTC to get into that, the next thing you know, somebody's filing a complaint against CTV Newsnet for saying something that bothers them.
But Jeffrey, it's not, I mean, Fox does not have the God-given right to be on our cable systems or to have access to Canadian viewers. It's a privilege for them to do it, right? Do you make the distinction there?
There's enough interest in a variety of sources of information, including Fox News and presumably RT, for some Canadians to want to consume it. Is it up to a government body like the CRTC to say what is acceptable speech and what is not? There's hate laws, and that's one thing. But to be offended by something, as I say, we don't have the right not to be offended. And I think that part of the digital culture is the fact that it has become so democratic, small d democratic, and not always in a good way, because it allows for a flourishing of various ideas that maybe a generation ago or maybe even 10 years ago we wouldn't be subjected to. And now I was seeing my students say, oh, well, that bothers me. I'm really that offends me. And I said, well, if you're offended, what are you going to do about it? And the fact is that there is, in the information culture, there's enough information to work against what you find to be offensive. And as a journalist, I would tell my students, you have the obligation to present alternatives. And if you can't do that, as you say, Steve, they're in the wrong business.
Well, let me find another scenario for Christopher to chew on, and that is this. What if enough people who are, for example, cable company consumers, decided to have a protest every weekend down at, and fill in the blank as to your favorite cable company, and tried to pressure them to take Fox out of the offering mix? Would the cable companies be within their appropriate rights in a democratic society to bow to that pressure and remove Fox from the menu of offerings?
A Tesla takedown, but for Fox News. Well, you could let the market decide, right? You know, as has been pointed out, by the time the CRTC actually got around to formally deauthorizing the distribution of RT, it was kind of moot because the cable providers had already done so. They sort of anticipated the political mood and the public mood. There's nothing to prevent the cable providers from saying it's not in our financial interest anymore to distribute Fox News, that this thing's a kind of a blight on our brand name. We get rid of it. We don't need the CRTC to tell us what to do.
What about that, Joanna? If the cable companies decided to do it, then it's kosher?
I think so. We saw something similar happen with Al Jazeera, not Al Jazeera English, which is permitted to air, but Al Jazeera Arabic. The CRTC decided that it could air only if cable companies monitored it 24/7 to screen for hate speech, glorification of terrorism, anti-Semitism, etc. And all of the cable carriers decided this is just not economical for us to keep up with. We're not going to carry it. And that's very philosophically different from a state broadcaster decision.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Jeffrey, you having spent time in the States, I want to, okay, let's just admit off the top here, I'm kind of reaching, but I'm going to give an example and you tell me if it makes any sense at all. You know, do you remember when this Pizzagate thing happened? This guy went a little bonkers and he thought that Hillary Clinton was running a child abuse ring in the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. And so he went there, because he heard it on TV, so it had to be true. He went down to this place with a loaded gun and he was going to shoot up the place to rescue these kids. And of course, the whole thing was bogus. It was a made-up thing from somebody who was trying to create mischief. You know, what if some disturbed person hears Jesse saying, I want my imperial thirst quenched by invading Canada. So, okay, Fox viewers, let's get out there and let's make some trouble for Canadians. Are we getting closer to a point where you'd be concerned about Fox?
I'm always concerned about Fox because it has a lot of influence, and that is a problem for those of us who feel it goes too far. I think one of the things that it's important for media organizations, here's looking at you, kid, to determine is what constitutes reliable information. Has the information been verified? How can we help the audience figure out what constitutes opining or bloviating and what constitutes reliable, verified information? I think the obligation on media organizations is to help consumers of information determine what is reliable and what is just dumb. And I think that that's going to put more pressure on organizations like the Toronto Star and TVO and the CBC to calm down for a minute and help the public understand exactly what's going on here. And I mean, a friend of mine who works for the Toronto Star, he and I had the same nightmare scenario. We imagined the 82nd Airborne marching along Bloor Street.
Now, a year ago, you would have thought that was completely crazy. Today, maybe not so much.
Exactly. So we need to help people understand what is acceptable content, acceptable information, how this can help us as citizens of either the U.S. or especially Canada to make sure that we're not overreacting to ridiculous information. We need to be more measured, I think, in how we respond.
Okay, well, that's not how I operate, so I'm going to continue to be unmeasured as I look for another what if. Okay, Joanna, take this one on. What if Trump becomes even more explicit in his rhetoric about taking over Canada? I mean, he's already said he wants to economically strangle us to becoming the 51st state. What if he starts musing about, as Thomas Jefferson said, it's, you know, merely for the marching. We're going to muse about sending some troops up there to take over. Would you be at a point then to start questioning whether Fox has a place in our landscape?
So if Fox was acting as a mouthpiece of the Trump administration
Yes.
and repeatedly, inciting violence against Canadians and Canadian democratic institutions, yes, then we've crossed arguably into a red line. And
I have found the example then. All right. Peter, how about you? If Fox crosses that line, is that a bridge too far?
Well, if it became a state broadcaster and it was doing that, then I think you could make the case before the CRTC that its cable license should be removed. Again, you have to remember that unless you get into, shutting down websites, the information is still going to be available in terms of that. But my sense of when you take these steps is more or less shots fired. I think that would be the point at which you do that, and that would be at that point you might shut down all American channels because they would all be carrying Trump's message. Some of them supportive, some of them unsupportive, but you would be in an emergency wartime situation, and then you can justify those sorts of actions. But outside of that, I can't see it.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you. You said if Fox became a state broadcaster. You know, there are plenty of people who think it already is, don't you?
Well, there's people who think the CBC is a state broadcaster too, right? I mean, just because you think something doesn't make it true, right? So I think we need to be careful about that, and we need to be careful about, as Jeffrey was saying, emotional overreaction. Like minor hockey coaches have 24-hour rules before you get back to them. We all can fall into the trap of reacting emotionally to something that we find irritating or offensive.
Okay, Coach Dornan, what would you, I mean, that example we've been talking about here, that if you started to see Fox parrot and or convey a more militaristic angle on the Trump administration's intentions about Canada, would you be prepared to ban the channel at that point?
Yes, and I'd remind us that the circumstances under which RT was deauthorized was because there was an armed conflict going on. The war wasn't happening here, but it was happening in Ukraine.
Okay, Sheldon, can I get a four shot for a second? Can you get all four guests? Perfect. That's what I'm looking for. Hands up, anybody who watches the evening primetime lineup on Fox News. Anybody here? Come on, somebody watches it. None of you are going to fess up that you watch it?
My grandmother does.
Your grandmother? Well, she's the target demographic, maybe. None of you watches it, really?
Okay, so I confess that I've watched it in hotels, but I don't subscribe to it, and I don't watch it. And when I watch it, it's when I'm traveling and I'm in a hotel and I go, okay, this should be good. This should be entertaining. This should be funny, just to keep up with it. But that's it.
Okay. Who's with me? Should we go down and burn down the White House? What do you think? Sorry, Christopher, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I don't subscribe to it, but you get to see it anyway. The juicy bits get clipped and then recycled on social media.
That is true, and you see it on MSNBC and CNN. They all love to have fun at each other's expense. Okay, thanks for that discussion, everybody. That's, boy, we're living in interesting times, aren't we? Okay, Peter Menzies, Christopher Dornan, Joanna Barron, Jeffrey Dvorkin, thanks a lot for joining us on TVO tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Elbows up.
In 1998, the measles virus was declared eliminated in Canada, and reported cases were typically associated with travel. But things have changed. More than 550 measles cases have been reported in Ontario so far this year. How did this happen, and how concerned should we be? Let's dig in with Dr. Jessica Hopkins. She is Vice President and Chief of Communicable Disease Control for Public Health Ontario. And thanks for making the trip up to our studio today.
Thanks for having me here.
When you get the measles, what happens?
Yeah, so the measles is a respiratory virus, and so it passes between people. And initially when it starts, it kind of looks like other respiratory infections. People can get runny nose, cough, red watery eyes. They get high fever, and then they get that typical rash that starts on the face and goes down the body. And it's something we're concerned about because it can actually be quite severe. So certain people can go on to develop things like pneumonia, they can get ear infections, and a very small number of people can actually die from it.
You can die from the measles?
Yeah.
Do you die from measles, or do you die from whatever the measles leads to?
Yeah, so you can die from measles. It can cause brain inflammation.
Sneezing, handshaking, how do you spread it?
Yeah, so it is spread through the air. So sneezing, coughing, it can put it into the air. And one of the things is the measles virus does a really good job of hanging around in the air afterwards. So if someone has measles, they go into a room, it can actually hang out in the air for 2 hours afterwards. The person leaves the room and someone can come in, breathe that in, and get infected. It's one of the most infectious diseases out there.
Okay, that was my next question, which is if you put it on a kind of a top 10 list of other communicable diseases, where does it rank?
It's very high, very near the top. So if, every person who has measles can spread it to more than 10 people. If you put a person with measles in a room of 100 people who are not immune to measles, probably about 90 of them are going to get the disease. It's very infectious.
If those 90 people are wearing masks, does that mean they won't get it?
So in terms of how we're going to stop measles, the best way to do that is really vaccination. Masking can play a role, particularly in healthcare settings, but because it hangs out in the air, typically you're going to need a really well-fitting respirator like an N95 or a KN95. And on a day-to-day basis, that's probably not the best way to prevent measles. Really, the best way is vaccination.
When you were a kid, or do you need another one as an adult, or what?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in Canada, we routinely give children 2 doses of measles vaccine. So they're going to get one usually at about 12 months of age. In Ontario, we give the second dose at 4 to 6 years of age. In 1998, Canada eliminated measles, and as part of that, we started to give people second doses of vaccine. So the key group that probably needs to look into whether or not they need a second dose are those born in 1970 to 1976, because they would have been out of high school when the catch-up was happening, and so would encourage those people to get their second dose, because if you've got 2 doses of measles vaccine, it's better than 98% protective against the disease. It's a really good vaccine.
If you were born in the 60s, 50s, 40s, etc., you're in the clear?
So if you were born before 1970, most people will be naturally immune to measles because they got it as a child. But if they know very well that they did not get it, then they could get a measles vaccine.
How do you treat it?
In terms of measles, it's supportive care. There is no specific drug that you can give people. So you're going to treat the symptoms of it, keep people hydrated, watch their fever. If they're more severe and they have pneumonia or brain inflammation, they're going to need a specialist to be able to help advise on their care. But generally, there isn't a specific treatment for it. That's why prevention's the best way to go.
A typical case takes how long to clear?
Yeah, so there's quite a long wait between if you get exposed to measles and you might potentially get measles. So there's kind of 21 days in there that you have to watch to see if you get infected. And then if you get infected, usually it's going to run its course in about a couple weeks' time.
If you're vaccinated, can you conclusively say, I'm in the clear, I don't have to worry about getting it?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's never 100% guarantees in life. As I said, the vaccine is really good. It's 98% plus protective for 2 doses. So that means there's going to be a small number of people that get it. And, you know, the information that we have from our outbreak really shows that if you look at the children who are not vaccinated, they make up like better than 90% of the cases of measles. So definitely the vaccine is highly protective. It's not 100%, but if you want to prevent measles, that's the best way to go.
We learned from COVID that there are a lot of different pharmaceutical companies that make vaccinations. Is it the same with measles?
So the measles vaccine, there are different manufacturers for it. In Canada, we have the MMR vaccine, so it comes as a combination, measles, mumps, and rubella.
I remember that, MMR.
Yes, MMR.
We used to have to take that little thing.
The yellow card?
The yellow card, that's right.
Yeah.
You stuck in your pocket, and
That's
that way
right.
you keep track of which one of your kids have had their shots.
That's right.
Do all kids who are born in the province of Ontario have to get MMR shots?
So in Ontario, all children should be offered an MMR shot. And then when they enter school, there's going to be a check to see who's up to date. The vast majority of parents decide to vaccinate their children in Ontario. And if they're not vaccinated, it's usually because they haven't made it to their primary care provider to get vaccinated. So that's a chance to catch up. Only a very small number decide not to vaccinate. And so in order to stay in school, you have to show either a reason that you can't be vaccinated, say you have a medical contraindication, or you can do a statement of objection.
Would a religious exemption exist?
That would be part of your statement of exemption.
That would be considered a part of that. Okay. If, as you tell us, this disease was eliminated, right? Not
That's
eradicated,
correct.
but eliminated in Canada back in 1998, why do we have more than 500 cases of it now?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of different factors that have come together. One of them certainly is the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we look at our uptake of vaccination pre-pandemic at 7 years of age for measles vaccine, sort of about 86% of children would have their 2 doses at 7 years of age. Public Health Ontario also looked at the 2023-24 school year. So as we've come out of the pandemic, we're at about 70%. And so we've seen a significant drop. And I think in a lot of cases, this has to do with people not being able to easily access healthcare during the pandemic. And so we've got some work to do to catch those children up. I also think we are struggling with things like misinformation, as well as a lot of parents have questions about vaccine. It takes time for them to talk to their healthcare providers to get the information they need to make the decision about vaccinating.
So if I'm hearing you right, vaccine hesitancy brought on by all of what was in the air over COVID may be contributing to the fact that 16% fewer people are getting their measles shots.
Yeah, so vaccine hesitancy definitely plays a role in this, as does, I think, access to health care.
Is there ever a good argument for not getting your kids vaccinated?
So from my perspective, I think if you want to protect your children against vaccine-preventable diseases, absolutely, immunizations are the best way to go. They've been around for many years. They are well studied. They are safe. And they protect against some really serious diseases. There are some rare cases where people can't be vaccinated. For example, with measles vaccine, if they are very immunosuppressed, they might not be able to. It's one of the reasons why actually as Canadians, I think it's really nice for us to all get vaccinated because we can protect those people who can't be vaccinated.
With as many hundreds of cases as you are now dealing with, does that mean we should go back to wearing masks?
So I would not recommend going back to wearing masks on a day-to-day basis to prevent measles vaccine. I would really recommend that people make sure that they are up to date and their children are up to date on measles vaccines.
And adults too?
Adults too, absolutely, especially those born 1970 to 1976 who might not have been eligible for that catch-up vaccine to get the second dose. If you haven't had a second dose, great idea to get it, especially for people who travel. I mean, we've always recommended the second dose in adulthood for people who travel outside of Canada to countries where measles circulates.
Now, when I got my COVID shots, they kind of knocked me out for a while, right? Like you get the shot and I was in bed for a day.
Okay.
Same thing here with measles?
So generally the measles vaccine is really well tolerated. I think with any immunization, people can expect their arm's going to be a little sore. Sometimes it can be red afterwards. Occasionally you'll see sometimes people get a rash afterwards. Anything more serious than that, allergic reactions, very rare. And in fact, kids get these vaccines on a daily basis through their primary care provider. Most within a day go back to doing their usual activities.
Now, I know when, at least I think I know, when you give out the flu shot every year, you're trying to sort of give your best guess as to what strain of flu is out there right now, and you try to match it with the vaccine.
Yeah.
Same principle with measles?
No, the measles vaccine is very stable and it's the same vaccine that we've been using for a long period of time. It does not need to change, which is why, we're looking at 2 lifetime doses that people need. It's not like the flu vaccine where you need to go back every year.
Because measles is the same every year, essentially the same thing? It doesn't
Yes, we don't need to change the vaccine.
Gotcha, okay. Let me read this. According to Public Health Ontario, October 2024, there was an exposure to, quote, a travel-related case in New Brunswick, ending up in hundreds of cases here. Okay, we've had travel-related cases of other things before, so why are we seeing this sort of outbreak now?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So the outbreak, we've got over 500 cases now associated with this outbreak. And really what we are seeing happening is because we have overall lower population measles vaccine coverage, that when the measles cases get into the community, they're not getting stopped. So what would happen before is you'd have someone who maybe traveled, brought it back into their community, but everybody around them was vaccinated. And so it kind of stopped there. It didn't spread any further. Whereas right now, we have some communities that have low vaccination rates. And so what happens is you get a case of measles in that community, and it's able to spread to one person, and then it spreads to the next person and the next person. So that's why we really need high vaccination rates as a population in order to break that chain of transmission and stop spread. I think, when we think about measles, one of the good things is we know what we need to do. We've eliminated this in 1998. So we know how to do this. We know how to watch for cases, and we know that the vaccine can prevent it. And we've got, a healthcare system that is set up to be able to give vaccines, especially in childhood. So I think this is, for anyone who wants to prevent it, now is really the time when you want to get in and make sure that your children's or your own vaccines are up to date.
Dumb question, but are the shots free?
The shots are free in Ontario, absolutely.
They are. So it's
Yeah.
like COVID, you could go,
You can go to your primary care provider to get vaccinated.
Pharmacies too, do they provide?
I don't believe pharmacies are providing this, although I'm not certain. You could check with your local pharmacy, but definitely routinely available through primary care.
Okay. Those 550 cases in the province of Ontario, geographically speaking, do you know where they are?
Geographically, they are in southwestern Ontario.
All of them?
Not all of them, no, but we're seeing cases across the province. And I think that's important for people to keep in mind is measles isn't about geography. It's not about gender. It's not, it can affect anyone who isn't immune. And so if you weren't born before 1970 and had measles, or you don't have the vaccines, you're going to be susceptible. So right now, that's where we're seeing the cases, but the risk exists across the province.
Is there a theory as to why southwestern Ontario would have a preponderance of the cases?
There's certainly anywhere that you are going to see lower rates of vaccine coverage is where you're going to see it. And there are some communities in Ontario that do have lower rates, and that's why we're seeing it there.
I'm really curious about you, in as much as, no doubt when you are doing your job for Public Health Ontario, you thought to yourself at some point, well, thankfully we don't have to worry about measles anymore because we got rid of this back in 1998, and yet here we are. Are you shocked?
Yeah, I mean, I never thought that I was going to see this kind of outbreak. Based on 1998, we had high levels of vaccine coverage pre-pandemic. I knew we were going to see cases come in and maybe a little bit of spread within families with imported cases. But I didn't expect to see this. But the part that I always hold with optimism is like we actually know how to fight this one. It's not like when I think back to 2020 and COVID, we didn't know a lot about the disease. With measles, it's been around for a long time. We know the disease well. We have the tools available for people to, basically prevent it through immunization. And so it really is literally, Ontarians, time to roll up our sleeves.
The difference is we've just been through COVID, and as a result, vaccine hesitancy. Some people don't like the idea of getting shots anymore. Some people think it's an infringement on their freedom. You've heard the long list of reasons why people don't want to do it. If we were at 86% once upon a time, which was a good number to be at, coverage, but we're only at 70% today, what do you think it's going to take to get us back up to that number?
So I think that one of the things that's actually happening at this time is there's large vaccination campaigns happening across the province, and particularly in those communities that are experiencing more measles outbreaks. So local public health units, healthcare providers in those areas really trying to get those numbers up. There is something called the Immunization of School Pupils Act in Ontario, and so public health units review the records for children in school every year to see whether or not they're up to date. And some parents who are listening may remember getting those letters from public health saying your child we don't have a record that they've received this vaccine. So it's a really good reminder. I mean, I work as a family doctor too, and I can say that most of the parents that I talk to actually do want to vaccinate their kids. It's just, I get it, life gets busy sometimes. And so I think at this moment, what we're really looking at is let's try and make this a priority in Ontario so that we can stop the outbreak and get things under control and get our numbers up again.
Okay, I hear you, but hesitancy or outright suspicion of the shot is not just life getting in the way. That's a decision that parents have made that for whatever reason, they are not necessarily there. So, I mean, I just remember doing all these kinds of interviews during COVID as well. Is there anything in particular that you can say to some people who are really dubious about the whole thing, about why it needs to get done?
Yeah. So in terms of the safety of the vaccine, it's proven to be safe. Measles can be a severe disease, and so I'd really encourage them, if you want the best protection for yourself and your family, get vaccinated. And I think look to credible sources. One of the things is there is a lot of misinformation that exists out there and disinformation. And so looking to credible sources of information, I would suggest look at immunize.ca is a great public resource for families communities. It's written in language that you can understand. It gives you other links. Public Health Agency of Canada, Public Health Ontario. Ours are a bit more technical, but again, will give you really quality information. Your local public health unit, your primary care provider. Talk to people who've spent a lot of time really looking into this and can answer your questions. And, I will say that's something I do in my family practice. When people come in with questions, we talk about it. That is part of the role of a healthcare provider, to engage in that and make sure that people feel comfortable with the decisions they're making.
Who's behind immunize.ca?
Oh, I'd have to go look at who actually operates it.
It's not you guys.
It's not us, no.
Okay.
It's been around for a number of years, and there's a number of experts that I know who are involved in it, but it's got really high-quality information on a wide variety of vaccine-related issues, including measles.
If we have 550 cases in the province of Ontario right now, do you know what the rest of Canada looks like, and are they suffering through this as well?
So right now, Ontario is seeing the most number of cases, but there are outbreaks happening in a number of provinces across Canada. I don't have the numbers with me, but the Public Health Agency of Canada website will report the numbers for all of Canada. But it is something that we need to think about as a nation. It is not just an Ontario issue.
And the States has got it too now.
The States has it as well.
Texas has, I think somebody died in Texas.
Yes, there have been 2 deaths.
Two deaths in Texas.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you're getting a handle on this? I know you're trying to get the message out that it's really up to us to make this thing go away, but do you feel like you're making progress?
Yeah, so I do think we're making progress. We're keeping a close eye on the numbers. Now, part of this is because the incubation period is longer, 21 days. It takes a bit of time for us to see whether or not the numbers are coming down. We are seeing some positive signs at this point in time, but we're not out of the woods yet. And so, again, this is something that can resurge if there's further spread in communities that are have lower rates of vaccination. So I wouldn't want us to become complacent at this point in time.
But not eradicated. What do we do? We eliminated. We eliminated
yes.
back in 1998.
That's right.
Can we get back there?
Absolutely, we can. So right now, Canada still holds elimination status. We would lose elimination status if we have spread within Canada after 12 months. And so we've been having this outbreak now for about 6 months. I think we've got 6 months to get this really under control, to break all the chains of transmission in Canada, and we can hold on to our elimination status. But more important than that, I think we really want to protect people. Like, at the end of the day, I don't want to see people in hospital because of this. We've already had 42 people in hospital because of this outbreak. I don't want to see deaths associated with the outbreak like what they've seen in Texas. And so, if we want to protect one another and we get vaccinated, we'll bring the rates up. And yes, that'll give us maintaining measles elimination status, but more importantly, a healthy population.
And elimination status is significant because what?
So elimination status, essentially means we got rid of the disease. Like, how amazing is that when you get rid of an infectious disease? But elimination status is granted by the World Health Organization.
What do you okay, since you mentioned the WHO, what do you think about what the current U.S. government is doing in terms of its relationship with the WHO?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I can't comment on the U.S. government, but I think the World Health Organization plays a really important role globally in terms of providing us with awareness of diseases that are happening in other countries, helping to coordinate public health around the globe. Certainly Canada contributes through that through the international health regulations. So when there are infectious diseases in other countries that might come to Canada, we hear about those. We also share information about what's happening in Canada so that others will know. So I really see it as part of the kind of global public health ecosystem.
Clearly, the Americans no longer have confidence in the role that the WHO plays, and they certainly don't want to be funding it anymore. Does anybody in the province of Ontario in a position of authority share that view to the best of your knowledge?
So I wouldn't be the best person to ask about that question.
You're the only one who's here today, though.
I know. My colleagues at Public Health Agency of Canada who have the link to WHO would really be the ones who can speak to that.
Do you still have confidence in the WHO?
Absolutely, I do. Yeah, I think the WHO provides a lot of really helpful information. They do a lot of work, especially in low and middle income countries. We live in a really global community. You can be anywhere within 24 hours. Diseases don't know borders, and so having an organization like the World Health Organization, which really convenes all of the nations around the globe to work together to improve health, I think that's a really important thing.
I mean, my suspicion is that there are a lot of people in this country who are paying attention to what's going on in the United States right now because there are lots of healthcare workers being laid off. The new Health and Human Services Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has taken, let's call it, a novel approach to the health of his country. You're watching that, I imagine, with a great deal of fascination. What do you think's going on?
So I think, like many Canadians, I'm really watching what's happening in the U.S. I think about things like, again, because we're a global community, things can pass across borders. So, the things that I'm really concerned about is, can we keep an eye on the infectious diseases that are coming into Canada? I think we have a really robust system at this point in time to be able to do this. But certainly think about, all of the information that is coming out of the U.S., much of which is inaccurate related to things like measles, and really wanting to make sure that we can give Canadians credible sources to look to. So that's what I'm really focused on. What can we do here in Ontario and in Canada to make sure that our public health system stays strong to protect everyone? I feel confident that here in Ontario that we are paying close attention to what's happening and we're taking steps to prepare so that we can be prepared for diseases like measles and other vaccine preventable diseases that could come into Canada.
Last question. Could this thing just sort of die out on its own eventually?
Yeah, so, I think that we don't want to wait to see if that's going to be the eventuality that will happen. I think we know how to stop this, and why would we not stop an infectious disease that harms people from spreading? So, I think that if we can get our vaccination rates up, we can actually stop this a whole lot faster than if we were to just let this run in the community. Gotcha.
That's Dr. Jessica Hopkins from Public Health Ontario. We thank you for coming into TVO tonight.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, April 1st, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, which party is best prepared to handle Canada's foreign policy? We'll explore that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Poly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.